Do you know where the absolute worst places to be in the United States are during a total power grid collapse? Not all retreats are created equal when facing real adversity. In today's video, we'll break down the top 10 worst places to be in during such an event. 10. Metropolitan areas. Let's start with the big cities like New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, and Philadelphia. These bustling metropolises are home to millions of people, and they rely on electricity for just about everything. From powering skyscrapers to keeping the subways running, electricity is the lifeblood of these cities. But if the power goes out, one could only imagine the chaos that would follow. Take New York City, for example. With around 8 million people squeezed into a small area, the city is like a pressure cooker just waiting to explode. During the blackout of 1977, the city descended into looting and rioting. And in 2003, another blackout left New Yorkers stranded in elevators and sweltering in the summer heat. Without power, the city's water supply could be at risk, and the economy could grind to a halt. It's a nightmare scenario that no one wants to imagine. Or consider Los Angeles, where over 3.8 million people navigate the city's infamous traffic every day. If the power goes out, getting out of the city could be next to impossible. In Chicago, known for its gridlocked streets and harsh winters, having an exit plan could be a matter of life and death. If everyone tries to flee at once, the roads could become impassable, leaving residents stranded in the city. And in Houston, one of the most congested cities in America, competition for resources could turn ugly fast. With millions of people vying for limited supplies, brutish tactics might become the norm. In Philadelphia, the Kensington neighborhood could be a hotspot for trouble. Desperate characters with little regard for human life could pose a threat to anyone unlucky enough to be caught in the chaos. All in all, being stuck in such metropolitan areas would be far from safe during a power grid collapse. 9. Urban centers. But it's not just the big cities that could be affected. Inner-city areas like Detroit, Baltimore, Oakland, Newark, and St. Louis are also at risk. Decades of economic decline and neglect have left these cities vulnerable to the domino effect of a power grid collapse. Abandoned buildings and neglected neighborhoods provide fertile ground for crime and lawlessness. Without electricity to power essential services, these areas could descend into chaos. And let's not forget about our dependence on modern conveniences. From heating and cooling systems to communication networks and electronic banking, city dwellers rely on electricity for just about everything. Without power, access to these essential services could be cut off, leaving residents feeling isolated and vulnerable. And with the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, cities like Detroit and Newark are particularly vulnerable. Aging infrastructure is ill-equipped to withstand the impact of hurricanes, heat waves, and flooding, leading to prolonged outages and exacerbating the challenges of recovery. It's surprising how, despite the looming threat of a power grid collapse, many urban centers remain woefully unprepared. Emergency response systems may be overwhelmed, and contingency plans may be inadequate to address the scale of the crisis. One of the most concerning aspects of a power grid collapse is the potential for cascading failures across critical infrastructure systems. As the power outage persists, systems that rely on electricity, such as water treatment plants and hospitals, may begin to fail. Without access to clean water and medical care, public health risks escalate, leading to a secondary crisis that compounds the initial disaster. History provides ample evidence of the devastating consequences of power grid collapses in these urban centers. From the blackout of 1977 in New York City to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, these events serve as sobering reminders of the fragility of modern urban infrastructure and how one collapse can lead to it all crumbling down. 8. Coastal regions. You might think coastal regions would be the ideal places to live, right? With their picturesque views and seaside charm, they do seem great, but when the power grid collapses, these areas can quickly turn into disaster zones. Take Miami, for example, the Sunshine State. With its sunny beaches and swaying palm trees, is a paradise. But when the power goes out, paradise can turn into a nightmare. The scorching heat and humidity make life unbearable without air conditioning. And let's not forget about hurricanes. Florida gets hit by about 2 hurricanes every year, with major ones striking every couple of years. According to Best Places, Florida experiences a tropical storm or hurricane roughly once every 3 years. However, the frequency has increased lately, with significant hurricanes hitting the state in both 2022 and 2023. In Southwest Florida, major storms occur approximately once every 5 years. These storms bring fierce winds and devastating floods, leaving millions without power and water. With over 22 million residents, densely populated cities like Miami could become battlegrounds for resources, leading to chaos and unrest. Another coastal region is New Orleans, known for its vibrant culture and delicious cuisine. This city has a darker side. Its aging infrastructure and vulnerability to flooding make it a ticking time bomb during a power outage. With essential services at risk and crime rates soaring, you wouldn't want to be in New Orleans when the power grid collapses. Similarly, if the power goes down in Houston, then it'd be fair to say, Houston, we have a problem. Situated on the Gulf Coast, Houston faces similar risks as other coastal cities: extreme weather, flooding, and infrastructural vulnerabilities. With its sprawling urban landscape, a power grid collapse could lead to chaos, limited resources, and potential social unrest. Similarly, San Francisco, the city by the bay, with its iconic hills and stunning views, is a favorite spot for tourists, but a nightmare when the power goes out. With limited access to sustainable food sources and overcrowded roads, escaping the city could be next to impossible. 7. Desert regions. These regions may evoke images of endless sand dunes and clear blue skies, but when the power grid fails, they become battlegrounds for survival. This is why places like Phoenix, Arizona, Las Vegas, Nevada, and Albuquerque, New Mexico, are among the worst places to be during such a crisis. First, in the scorching deserts of Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Albuquerque, extreme temperatures are the norm, with summer days regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and nights offering little relief. The absence of air conditioning can quickly turn homes into ovens. The elderly, infants, and those with medical conditions are particularly at risk. Furthermore, without electricity to power water treatment plants, the risk of contaminated water sources escalates, compounding the humanitarian crisis. Secondly, water scarcity is a constant concern in desert regions, where cities like Las Vegas rely heavily on imported water sources. However, without electricity to power pumping stations and treatment facilities, access to clean water becomes severely compromised. The disruption to water supplies intensifies the crisis, leading to sanitation issues and the risk of disease outbreaks. Similarly, air conditioning is essential for survival in desert climates. But during a power grid collapse, the loss of cooling systems renders homes uninhabitable. Sensitive equipment and electronics are vulnerable to overheating, exacerbating the crisis. The absence of air conditioning not only jeopardizes human health, but also poses risks to essential infrastructure. 6. Remote rural areas. Imagine being stranded in the vast wilderness with no electricity, no communication, and no hope of rescue. For residents of remote rural areas like Montana, Wyoming, and Alaska, this nightmare scenario is all too real during a power grid collapse. One reason is that they are spread across expansive landscapes. Because of this, these remote rural communities find themselves cut off from essential supply lines and emergency services. With miles of wilderness separating towns and villages, travel becomes arduous, if not impossible. Modern infrastructure forms the backbone of daily life in remote rural areas, from electricity and telecommunications to transportation and healthcare. Without electricity, critical services like heating, refrigeration, and medical care are compromised, leaving residents exposed to the elements and vulnerable to illness or injury. The environment doesn't help either. From bitter cold and blizzards to scorching heat and wildfires, remote rural areas are subject to a myriad of environmental challenges. In the aftermath of a collapse, residents must confront these challenges head-on, braving the elements without the safety net of modern infrastructure. From blizzards to avalanches, the wilderness poses formidable obstacles to survival. 5. Northern regions. Cities like Minneapolis, Minnesota, Buffalo, New York, and Anchorage, Alaska, are some northern areas you wouldn't want to be in when the power grid goes down. Take Minneapolis, Minnesota, for example. Despite official reports suggesting a drop in crime, serious offenses like aggravated assault and carjacking continue to rise. The city remains tense, with an underlying unease that's like a ticking time bomb ready to explode. The rise in crime rates is a significant concern in Minneapolis, indicating ongoing issues with violence and lawlessness. Trust in law enforcement has been strained, adding to feelings of insecurity among residents. If a power grid collapse were to occur, the breakdown of essential services could worsen an already unstable situation. Disruptions to communication and transportation would hinder emergency response efforts, leaving residents feeling isolated and vulnerable. Buffalo, New York faces similar challenges to Minneapolis, with its own set of circumstances. Economic decline and social issues have left the city struggling, compounded by aging infrastructure ill-prepared for a major power outage. The city's electrical grid is fragile, and harsh winters only exacerbate the risks. Located near Lake Erie, Buffalo is prone to extreme weather events like heavy snowfall and ice storms. Similarly, Anchorage, Alaska faces unique challenges due to its geographic location and seismic activity. Situated on the Pacific Ring of Fire, the city is at constant risk of earthquakes, with devastating consequences for its infrastructure. The loss of electricity would cripple critical services like hospitals and emergency response, leaving residents vulnerable in the aftermath. Anchorage's remote location and harsh climate make restoring power after a collapse difficult, prolonging the blackout and increasing isolation. Climate change adds another layer of risk, with thawing permafrost and rising sea levels threatening the city's infrastructure. So basically, Anchorage must contend with both natural disasters and man-made crises, making it one of the worst places to be during a power grid collapse. 4. Southern regions. In the event of a power grid collapse, southern regions like Atlanta, Georgia, Dallas, Texas, and Charlotte, North Carolina face significant challenges that can disrupt daily life and pose serious risks to residents. Here's why these areas might be the worst places to be during such a crisis. First up, they have fragile infrastructure. Southern regions heavily rely on complex electrical networks to power their bustling cities and sustain essential services. However, this infrastructure is often fragile and susceptible to failure, especially during emergencies. In cities like Atlanta, the strain on these systems could lead to widespread blackouts, creating chaos and disrupting vital services. Similarly, the southern United States is prone to extreme weather conditions like hurricanes, tornadoes, and severe storms. These events pose a significant threat to power infrastructure, as seen during Hurricanes Katrina and Harvey. In Dallas, Texas, located in Tornado Alley, severe weather can cause extensive damage to power grids, leaving residents vulnerable to prolonged outages and their associated hardships. Cities like Charlotte and Atlanta are densely populated urban centers where millions rely on electricity for daily life. From powering homes and businesses to sustaining critical infrastructure like hospitals and transportation systems, the dependence on electricity is immense. A collapse in these areas could lead to flood and water shortages, compromised healthcare, and widespread disruption. Adding to the troubles, southern regions often lack sufficient investment in backup power systems and emergency preparedness, leaving them ill-equipped to withstand the fallout of a collapse. Unlike regions with more robust resilience measures, southern areas may struggle to cope with prolonged outages and their effects on communities. What's worse is that the impact of a collapse is disproportionately felt by vulnerable communities, exacerbating existing socioeconomic disparities. Low-income neighborhoods in cities like Atlanta and Dallas may lack access to backup power sources and resources to cope with the aftermath. Disparities in access to information and resources can deepen inequalities during a crisis. And finally, supply chain disruptions. Southern regions are crucial to the nation's supply chain, with major transportation hubs supporting the flow of goods and services. A collapse in cities like Atlanta and Dallas could disrupt these vital supply chains, leading to shortages of essential goods and services locally and nationally. 3. Isolated islands, communities. At least the rest of the areas we mentioned are connected by roads. One of the worst-case scenarios you could find yourself in is if you're stranded on an isolated island during a power grid collapse. Picture the Hawaiian Islands, surrounded by the vast Pacific Ocean. This isolation poses a challenge during a power grid collapse, with aid having to traverse long distances over water. Relief efforts are delayed, leaving residents vulnerable. Hawaii heavily relies on imports for essential goods like food, fuel, and medical supplies. Without electricity to power ports and distribution systems, the flow of these critical resources grinds to a halt, leading to shortages and price hikes. And what about Hawaii's tourism industry, the lifeblood of its economy? A prolonged collapse would spell disaster, with hotels, attractions, and transportation left powerless. Mass cancellations and job losses would ripple through the tourism sector, crippling the economy. Similarly, if we look at the Appalachian Mountains, the isolated communities in West Virginia face their own set of challenges during a collapse. Nestled within this rugged landscape, aid struggles to reach remote areas due to challenging terrain and limited infrastructure. Basic services like water supply and healthcare become compromised, deepening the hardships faced by residents. Appalachia's economy, reliant on industries like manufacturing and mining, would be hit hard by a collapse. Widespread job losses and financial strain would exacerbate the region's already existing poverty and unemployment. And healthcare access? Limited at best. Without electricity, hospitals and clinics struggle to operate medical equipment, leaving residents vulnerable and exacerbating existing health disparities. Another area you would never wish to be in during a power grid collapse would be the rural areas of Maine, characterized by vast forests and sparse populations. During a collapse, access to resources and assistance becomes limited in these remote areas. Harsh winters with freezing temperatures and heavy snowfall pose additional challenges, jeopardizing heating systems and hindering emergency response efforts. Maine's economy, heavily reliant on agriculture and fishing, would suffer. Food shortages and economic losses would ripple through rural communities, impacting farmers and fishermen. And in a world reliant on connectivity, rural areas of Maine often lack reliable internet and communication infrastructure. During a collapse, this hampers emergency response efforts and leaves residents feeling isolated and uncertain. 2. Industrial zones. Imagine a world where the lights dim, machines fall silent, and the heartbeat of industry comes to a halt. This isn't a scene from a movie. It's the reality of a power grid collapse. And when it comes to vulnerable places, industrial zones like Gary, Indiana, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania top the list. Take Gary, Indiana, for example. Nestled by Lake Michigan, this city has a rich industrial history, especially in steel production. But with great reliance on manufacturing comes great vulnerability. Gary's economy thrives on industries like steel, but without a steady power supply, these factories grind to a halt. Jobs are lost and economic losses mount, hitting the economy hard. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, known for its vibrant culture, also boasts a significant industrial complex along the Mississippi River. But when the lights go out, so do the city's crucial operations. Petrochemical plants and refineries rely on continuous power to maintain safety protocols. A power grid collapse could lead to chemical leaks and fires, posing grave risks to both the environment and residents. Then there's Pittsburgh, once hailed as the Steel City. While it's diversified its economy, the heavy industry still looms large. But when the power fails, so does the city's resilience. Critical infrastructure like power plants and transportation networks rely on electricity to function. Without it, the city faces disruptions in energy supply and communication, plunging residents into chaos. 1. Areas with aging infrastructure. And finally, the last place you'd want to be during a power grid collapse would be areas with aging infrastructure. Places like Flint, Michigan, Cleveland, Ohio, and various cities in New Jersey fall under this category. Let's start with Flint, Michigan, known for its water crisis. Flint's infrastructure problems extend beyond lead-contaminated pipes to its electrical grid. Decades of neglect have left the city's power infrastructure outdated and fragile. Flint's decline began with the collapse of its automotive industry, leading to economic struggles and population decline. With fewer resources, maintaining the power grid became increasingly difficult, leaving it vulnerable to breakdowns during a crisis. Then we have Cleveland, Ohio. Once a thriving industrial hub, Cleveland now grapples with the legacy of its past glory. Like Flint, Cleveland's infrastructure has suffered from years of neglect and decline. The city's electrical grid, built for a bygone era, struggles to meet modern demands. Aging substations and power lines are prone to failure, especially under stress conditions like a power grid collapse. Similarly, we have various cities across New Jersey. Despite its prosperity, many cities across the state face similar challenges with aging infrastructure. Decades of urbanization and suburban sprawl have strained New Jersey's utilities. Limited funding and political gridlock have hampered efforts to modernize the electrical grid, leaving communities vulnerable during a crisis. But let's say you find yourself in these areas. What do you do next? Click the video on screen now to learn about the 14 crucial items you must have in situations like these.